I hope this finds you well. Due process is so very important to every citizen of the United States. It directly impacts what the government can and can't do with your rights. Due process prohibits a state from depriving an individual or group of individuals of their rights by establishing procedural safeguards. A deprivation occurs when there is no remedy or inadequate remedies are afforded by the government. A right is something that is fundamental to liberty and so deeply rooted in our history and tradition. The Due Process Clause of the Fifth Amendment applies to the federal government, and the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment applies to the states. So let's get started. Due process comes in two flavors: procedural due process and substantive due process. We're going to look at each of them in turn. Procedural due process requires notice and an opportunity to be heard before life, liberty, or property can be taken. Just for a moment, we're going to take a brief sidestep just to look at some examples of life, liberty, or property. Deprivation of life is pretty self-explanatory. Deprivation of liberty isn't as clear. Deprivation of liberty is the loss of any kind of significant freedom to act, or the denial of one of your freedoms provided to you by the Constitution or a statute. An example of this would be the exercising of a fundamental right. Deprivation of property, at first blush, appears to be anything that you physically own, but it's way more than that. An individual has a property interest in anything that they have a legitimate claim to or are entitled to under state or federal law. And this can even be welfare benefits, some forms of employment, as well as public school attendance. Now let's get back on the beaten path. So how do you know how much procedural due process is required? Remember, that's our notice and our hearing. The Supreme Court uses a balancing test. That balancing test is from a case in 1976 called Matthews versus Eldridge, and it has come to be known as the Matthews balancing test or economic balancing test. There are three factors that the court weighs in determining how much procedural due process is required. First, you look at the nature of the private interest, meaning its importance. Fundamental rights, of course, are very important. Second, the court looks at the ability of the procedure used by the government to increase the accuracy of its decisions, basically preventing arbitrary application of a law or a decision. And finally, the court looks at the government's interest. So that's procedural due process in a nutshell. Let's move on to substantive due process. Substantive due process is no longer concerned with whether the government provided notice and a hearing before it deprived someone of life, liberty, or property. Substantive due process asks whether or not the government had sufficient justification for infringing on a right. Said differently, substantive due process ensures that laws or government actions are reasonable. The Supreme Court determines whether a law or government action has gone too far through the use of standards. With substantive due process, we are concerned with two standards: the strict scrutiny standard and the rational basis or minimum scrutiny standard. So how do you know which one to apply? Well, it depends on whether a fundamental right is at stake. Examples of fundamental rights are your right to raise your children, your right to marry, right to privacy, etc. Unless it's a fundamental right at stake, the rational basis test applies. Examples of when the rational basis test would be triggered include economic interests, lifestyle choices, taxation, basically any time a fundamental right is not involved. So here are the standards. The court applies strict scrutiny when a fundamental right is involved. The government, in that case, has the burden of showing that the law was necessary to achieve a compelling government interest or purpose. The court will apply the rational basis test in all other cases, and under the rational basis test, The individual that's challenging that government law must be able to show that the law is not rationally related to a legitimate government interest. And that's substantive due process in a nutshell. I know that substantive due process and equal protection can be very similar, but the easiest way to remember the difference between equal protection, which will be discussed in a different video, and substantive due process is that substantive due process is concerned when a law limits the liberty of all people, whereas equal protection is only concerned when the law is treating a person or class of persons differently from others. Thanks for watching.